He was a ghost haunting his own palace, a man-child on a throne whose most famous utterance was not a declaration of war but a frustrated cry for apricot dumplings. He was dismissed by his own court as a simpleton, a living embarrassment to the most powerful dynasty in Europe. Yet he was Ferdinand I, by the grace of God, Emperor of Austria, and Apostolic King of Hungary. His name was Ferdinand I. How could this broken man, this phantom ruler who was never truly allowed to reign, commit the one act of profound clarity that saved his empire from utter collapse by willingly giving it all away? To understand the tragedy of Ferdinand, you must first understand the world that made him, a world built on the ashes of revolution and forged in the unquenchable fires of war. He was born in Vienna on the 19th of April, 1793. It was a year of terror. Across the border in France, the revolution had devoured its own children and was now turning on its kings. The guillotine's blade, a horrifying symbol of a world turned upside down, was rising and falling with sickening regularity in the Place de la Révolution. Just 3 months before Ferdinand's birth, King Louis XVI had met his end there. 9 months later, it would be the turn of Ferdinand's own aunt, the Austrian-born Queen of France, Marie Antoinette. For the House of Habsburg, the oldest and most regal dynasty in Europe, this was not just a distant political crisis, it was a visceral, existential threat. The news that reached the Hofburg Palace in Vienna was of a familiar world being systematically dismantled. The very idea of deposing a monarch, let alone subjecting one to a public, humiliating execution, was a blasphemy against the divine order that had held their universe together for centuries. Kings were chosen by God, not by mobs. To kill a king was to spit in the face of heaven itself. Ferdinand's father was Francis II, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was a man defined by this trauma. He was not a warrior king. He was a bureaucrat, a pedant, a ruler who found comfort in paperwork and rigid routine. He was meticulous, dour, and deeply conservative, a man whose primary political instinct was caution. The whirlwind of the French Revolution and the subsequent rise of Napoleon Bonaparte was his personal nightmare made real. He saw the Corsican upstart, this emperor of the French, this product of chaos, tear across Europe, dismantling ancient kingdoms and redrawing maps with the tip of his sword. The humiliations came one after another. In 1805, at the Battle of Austerlitz, the Battle of the Three Emperors, Napoleon inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the combined Austrian and Russian armies. Francis had to watch from a nearby hilltop as his imperial forces were shattered. The French army marched into his capital, Vienna, and Napoleon himself slept in the Schönbrunn Palace, the Habsburgs' own summer residence. The psychological blow was immense. The following year, to prevent Napoleon from claiming the ancient and venerable title for himself, Francis was forced into the ultimate degradation for a Habsburg ruler. He formally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, an institution his family had led almost without interruption for nearly 400 years. With a stroke of a pen, 1,000 years of history were wiped away. He rebranded his domains as the new, more modest Austrian Empire. The pain did not stop there. After another defeat at the Battle of Wagram in 1809, Vienna was occupied again. The subsequent Treaty of Schönbrunn was brutal. Austria lost its access to the sea, was forced to pay a massive indemnity, and had to slash the size of its army. And then came the most personal humiliation of all. To secure a fragile peace, Francis was forced to marry his beloved eldest daughter, Marie-Louise, to the very man who had brought his empire to its knees. The Habsburg Archduchess, a princess of the most ancient royal blood, became the wife of the self-made Corsican ogre. For Francis, a devoted family man, it was a sacrifice that broke his heart. The trauma of these 2 decades, the endless wars, the territorial losses, the occupation of his capital, the forced alliance, the sacrifice of his daughter, forged the political philosophy that would dominate Ferdinand's entire life. After Napoleon's final cataclysmic defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the leaders of Europe, the kings and ministers of the Old World, gathered at the Congress of Vienna. Their goal was singular, obsessive, and born of pure fear: to turn back the clock. They were determined to build a fortress against the future. The architect of this new order was Austria's brilliant, charming, and ruthlessly conservative statesman, Prince Clemens von Metternich. For the next 30 years, he would be the master puppeteer of European politics. Metternich believed that the French Revolution and Napoleon had unleashed 2 demonic forces upon the world: liberalism and nationalism. Liberalism, with its dangerous talk of constitutions, individual rights, and popular sovereignty, threatened the absolute power of monarchs. Nationalism, the even more explosive idea that people of a common language, culture, and history should have their own state, was a revolutionary poison that could dissolve the multi-ethnic Habsburg Empire from within. The Austrian Empire was not a nation-state in the modern sense. It was a sprawling dynastic patchwork of territories, held together only by the person of the emperor. It contained Germans in Austria proper, Magyars in Hungary, Czechs in Bohemia and Moravia, Poles and Ukrainians in Galicia, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, Romanians, and Italians in Lombardy, Venetia. To grant any one of these groups national self-determination would be to light a fuse that would blow the entire structure apart. So the Metternich system was designed to suffocate these ideas at birth. It was a system of repression, control, and enforced stagnation. A vast network of secret police and informants, the notorious Geheime Staatspolizei, monitored the citizens of the empire. Mail was routinely opened and read. Books and newspapers were subjected to strict censorship. Plays were vetted for any hint of subversive thought. University professors were watched for any sign of liberal thinking, and students were discouraged from forming associations. The goal was to create a society that was stable, orderly, and, above all, predictable. Change was the enemy. Metternich famously declared, "Asia begins at the Landstrasse," a main road leading out of Vienna, implying that anything beyond the city's controlled environment was a descent into barbarism and chaos. The state encouraged a culture known as Biedermeier, a retreat from the turbulent world of politics into the safe, cozy confines of domestic life. People were encouraged to focus on family, furniture, music, and art, anything but public affairs. This was the gilded cage into which Crown Prince Ferdinand was born and raised. The Hofburg Palace in Vienna was the nerve center of this system, a labyrinth of suffocating protocol, ancient tradition, and elaborate ceremony. Life was dictated by the rigid rules of Spanish court etiquette, a relic from centuries past that governed every aspect of daily existence. Every bow, every gesture, every meal was a choreographed performance of power and legitimacy. It was a world that demanded physical perfection, mental acuity, and an iron will. It was a world utterly, cruelly unprepared for an heir like Ferdinand. He was the eldest son, the crown prince, the future emperor. But from his earliest days, it was painfully, embarrassingly clear to everyone around him that he was not like the others. He was fragile, sickly, and broken. And in the unyielding, merciless world of the Habsburgs, fragility was an unforgivable sin. From the moment of his birth, Ferdinand was a source of deep and abiding anxiety for his parents and the court. He was the product of a marriage between double first cousins, Francis II and Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily. Such unions were a hallmark of Habsburg dynastic policy, a deliberate strategy to consolidate power and keep vast territories and titles within the family. But generations of inbreeding had come at a terrible genetic cost. The most visible sign was the infamous Habsburg jaw, a pronounced underbite that afflicted many members of the family. But Ferdinand inherited a far more debilitating and tragic collection of ailments. He was born with hydrocephalus, a condition colloquially known as water on the brain, where an excess of cerebrospinal fluid leads to an abnormally large head. His skull was misshapen, his features seemed oddly proportioned, and this visible deformity marked him from infancy. As a child, he was frail and sickly, suffering from a severe case of rickets that left his legs permanently bowed. His gait was awkward and unsteady, a lurching shuffle that made him appear clumsy and uncoordinated. But the most terrifying of his afflictions, the one that would define his life and shape the court's perception of him, was epilepsy. In an age with no effective treatment and little medical understanding, these violent seizures were shrouded in fear and superstition. They were often referred to as the falling sickness and were seen by many as a sign of divine displeasure or even demonic possession. Throughout his life, Ferdinand would be struck by these fits, sometimes suffering as many as 20 in a single day. They came without warning, his body stiffening, his limbs convulsing, his consciousness lost to the world. They were frightening to witness, and they left him exhausted, disoriented, and confused for hours afterward. The need to manage and conceal these seizures would become a central, secret preoccupation of the imperial court. His severe physical problems were compounded by what was perceived as a profound intellectual disability. His oversized head, his slurred, stuttering speech, and his awkward physical presence combined to create the impression of a simpleton. He struggled to articulate his thoughts, often speaking in short, childlike phrases. He found it difficult to grasp complex or abstract concepts and had a short attention span. His father, Emperor Francis, a man for whom duty and diligence were the highest virtues, was deeply troubled and at times exasperated by his son's condition. In his private correspondence, the emperor lamented his heir's shortcomings. He acknowledged Ferdinand's good heart, but worried that his boundless ill temper and mental limitations would render him incapable of ruling. The court, a place of whispering ambition, merciless judgment, and intricate political games, was not kind to the young archduke. He was largely isolated, kept away from public view as much as possible to avoid embarrassing the dynasty. His younger brother, Archduke Franz Karl, though also considered weak-willed and unintelligent, was at least physically sound. The contrast between the two only highlighted Ferdinand's deficiencies. He became an object of pity for some, quiet scorn for others, and a source of political anxiety for all. Who would truly rule when this broken prince inherited the throne? His education was a constant, frustrating struggle. A succession of tutors, led by Baron Joseph von Erberg, tried to mold him into a future emperor. They despaired of his inability to focus on political science, military strategy, or the complex history of his own domains. Lessons would often end in frustration, with Ferdinand either dissolving into a temper tantrum or simply staring blankly, his mind seemingly elsewhere. The carefully constructed narrative of Ferdinand as a complete imbecile, however, is an oversimplification, a cruel caricature created by his political enemies and later reinforced by lazy historical accounts. Hidden beneath the thicket of his disabilities was a mind with its own unique curiosities, talents, and passions. He possessed an almost obsessive interest in the natural world, particularly botany. He could spend hours on end happily cataloging plants, sketching them with surprising accuracy, and meticulously recording his observations in his journals. His knowledge in this field was not that of an amateur, it was systematic and scientific. He also had a deep fascination with technology and agriculture. On his travels through the empire, he would ignore the political delegations and ceremonial displays, instead taking copious notes on new farming techniques, the workings of a steam engine, or the design of a new factory loom. He was a man of the tangible, the practical, the observable. Furthermore, he had a surprising and often overlooked gift for languages. Despite his severe speech impediment, he was fluent in 5, the official German of the court, the crucial Hungarian of the empire's Second Kingdom, the Czech of his beloved Bohemia, and the Italian and French, necessary for any European aristocrat. This linguistic ability demonstrated a cognitive capacity that his detractors refused to see. He was also a passionate lover of music, another field where his soul could find an expression that his tongue denied him. He learned to play the trumpet and the piano with a heartfelt enthusiasm that, while perhaps lacking in technical brilliance, was genuine and deeply felt. But these were the gentle private pursuits of a country squire or a university professor, not of a future absolute monarch of a sprawling, volatile empire. His father knew this all too well. As Emperor Francis lay on his deathbed in February 1835, his mind was consumed with a single overriding fear: the future of the empire under his son. His final act was to draft a political testament, a desperate attempt to rule from the grave and to build a cage of advisors around Ferdinand that would protect both the boy and the throne. The will was explicit and became the guiding document for the next era. He instructed Ferdinand in a phrase that would become infamous: rule and change nothing. It was a command to maintain the status quo, to resist all reform, and to keep the Metternich system perfectly intact. He then urged his son to place his absolute trust in 2 men: his uncle, the unimaginative but loyal Archduke Louis, and, most importantly, Prince Metternich, whom he described as my most loyal servant and friend. To ensure this, Francis formally created a Regency Council, the secret state conference, Geheime Staatskonferenz, to govern in Ferdinand's name. This body was designed to be the real power in the empire. It was to be a triumvirate of power and personality. The brilliant, vain, and internationally famous Prince Metternich would handle foreign affairs and be the public face of the government. The dull, rigid, and deeply conservative Archduke Louis, Ferdinand's uncle, would oversee internal policy and represent the dynasty. And the ambitious, reform-minded, and perpetually irritable Count Franz Anton von Kolowrat-Liebsteinski would manage the state's ever-troubled finances. In theory, these 3 men were to advise the emperor. In reality, they were to be the government. Ferdinand was to be a living symbol, a biological necessity, a rubber stamp for the decisions of other, more capable men. His role was to exist, to sign the papers they placed in front of him, and to otherwise remain as invisible as possible. The system was designed to function without him, to treat the emperor himself as a constitutional formality in an otherwise absolute monarchy. It was a bizarre, unprecedented, and ultimately dysfunctional solution to the problem of a disabled heir. It was a ticking time bomb placed at the very heart of the Austrian state. In March 1835, Emperor Francis died. The news spread through the Habsburg palace first as a hushed whisper, then as a formal black-creeped announcement that echoed through the cold marble corridors. For 31 years, the diligent dour emperor had been the unmoving center of the Austrian universe. His passing was not just the death of a man, it was the extinguishing of the last living link to the pre-revolutionary world, the final closure of the long, traumatic chapter of the Napoleonic Wars. A palpable sense of dread settled over Vienna. The system Francis and Metternich had built was designed for stability, but it was a brittle, fragile stability that depended entirely on a firm hand at the helm. Now, that hand was gone, and in its place was the trembling, uncertain grasp of his son. The broken prince, now a man of 41, became his imperial and royal apostolic majesty. Ferdinand I, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, Croatia, and Bohemia, King of Lombardy, Venetia, and holder of a dozen other grand and ancient titles. The official proclamations were read out across the empire, but in the coffee houses of Vienna, in the salons of the aristocracy, and in the chanceries of Europe, the reaction was one of disbelief and barely concealed alarm. A Viennese doctor, Michael von Peidel, famously summarized the mood in his diary. "It is a real pity that our emperor is so intellectually void, as otherwise he is a really good-natured man. The whole city is talking about it. They say a commission has been appointed to supervise him." In the streets, a cruel but telling joke began to circulate. The Viennese had nicknamed the late emperor Francis Franz der Gute, Francis the Good, for his paternalistic, albeit authoritarian style. Now, when comparing the new emperor to his predecessor, people would twist his honorific title, Ferdinand der Gütige, Ferdinand the Benign, into the mocking Gütinan der Fertig, Gütinan the Finished. It was a brutal pun, capturing the widespread conviction that the new reign was over before it had even begun. The first meetings of the Secret State Conference were an immediate confirmation of these fears. The three men entrusted with running the empire, the suave diplomat Metternich, the stubborn bureaucrat Kolovrat, and the dynastic placeholder Archduke Louis, gathered around a table with their new sovereign. Ferdinand sat at the head, a bewildered, silent spectator at the theater of his own government. The proceedings quickly devolved into a bitter contest of wills between the two dominant personalities, Metternich and Kolovrat. These two men despised each other with a passion that poisoned the very air of the council chamber. Their rivalry was personal, political, and ideological. Metternich, the Chancellor of State, saw himself as the grand guardian of European order. He was a man of immense vanity, a master of diplomacy and intrigue, who viewed governance as a delicate art of balancing great powers. He cared little for the mundane details of internal administration, which he considered beneath him. Count Kolovrat, the Minister of the Interior, was his polar opposite. A Bohemian aristocrat, he was dour, industrious, and possessed a deep and abiding suspicion of Metternich's worldliness and extravagant spending. Kolovrat saw himself as a reformer, albeit a cautious one, who believed the empire needed administrative and economic modernization to survive. He championed the interests of the Bohemian nobility and constantly sought to undermine Metternich's influence. Archduke Louis, who was supposed to preside over this dysfunctional arrangement, was hopelessly out of his depth. He was a man of limited intellect and even more limited imagination, whose only guiding principle was a rigid adherence to the wishes of his dead brother. His attempts to mediate between the two rivals were feeble and invariably ended with him sighing in exasperation and postponing any decision. Ferdinand's role in these proceedings was tragicomic. He would sit through hours of heated, often vicious debate, his face a mask of incomprehension. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was often to ask a simple tangential question that revealed his complete detachment from the topic at hand. On one occasion, during a tense discussion about the budget, he reportedly interrupted Collerat to ask if the minister knew what was for lunch. On another, he simply fell asleep. His personal diary from this period is a testament to his profound alienation from the power he supposedly wielded. It is not the record of a ruler. There are no grand reflections on policy, no strategic calculations, no expressions of imperial vision. Instead, it is the simple, earnest, and often poignant chronicle of his daily life. A typical entry concerning his official duties reads, "Afternoon conference." The gentlemen were again very fierce with each other. I, however, was especially gracious to them all. Evening, to the theater. They were giving The False Cat. It was very amusing. He recorded the weather, the health of his wife, the plays he attended, and the small pleasures of a walk in the Prater Park. The affairs of state were just a tedious, incomprehensible noise that he had to endure before he could get back to his real life. Yet there were flashes of a weary self-awareness. In an 1841 entry, he wrote with startling clarity about his own predicament. The dispute between Metternich and Collerat is the main course. I myself am the roast who has to suffer for it all, but I will not give in. This small, sad confession reveals that he was not entirely oblivious to his situation. He understood he was a pawn in their game, a passive object, caught between two grinding millstones. He was the emperor, but he was also a prisoner, and his reign was a form of daily torment. The result of this governmental paralysis was disastrous. Critical reforms were endlessly debated and then shelved. The empire's finances deteriorated, infrastructure projects stalled, and the deep systemic problems, the rising tide of nationalism, the growing discontent of the peasantry, the economic stagnation were left to fester. The government that was designed to be a bulwark of stability was, in fact, creating the very conditions for the explosion that was to come. With the reality of the emperor's condition being an open secret within the court, the public presentation of the new reign became an exercise in carefully managed stagecraft. The dynasty needed to project an image of seamless continuity and unwavering power. This meant proceeding with the traditional coronation ceremonies in the empire's various kingdoms. These events were political theater on the grandest scale, designed to awe the populace and affirm the legitimacy of Habsburg rule. For Ferdinand, they were a series of bewildering and exhausting ordeals. The first major ceremony took place in September 1836 in Prague, where he was to be crowned King of Bohemia with the ancient crown of St. Wenceslas. The city was decked in the imperial colors of black and gold. The nobility of the kingdom gathered to pay homage. The ceremony itself, held in the magnificent St. Vitus Cathedral, was a long, complex ritual steeped in centuries of tradition. Ferdinand, dressed in heavy coronation robes, had to navigate the intricate choreography, coached at every step by anxious aides. It was during the lavish coronation banquet that followed that the most famous and revealing anecdote of his reign occurred. The story has been told and retold so many times that it has passed into legend, its details likely embellished over the years, but its core remains a perfect illustration of his character. As the endless courses were being served, Ferdinand, who had a notoriously sweet tooth and a particular fondness for apricot dumplings, Marillenknödel, saw them on the menu. When the dish failed to appear, he anxiously summoned a court official. The official, with a deferential bow, explained that apricots were unfortunately out of season, and thus the dumplings could not be prepared. Ferdinand's reaction was not one of quiet disappointment. Instead, years of repressed frustration, the humiliation of being constantly managed, and his simple, direct nature erupted. He reportedly slammed his fist on the great banquet table, rattling the fine china and silencing the assembled nobles. In his thick, slurred speech, he cried out, "Ich bin der Kaiser und ich will Knödel." I am the emperor and I want dumplings. The story, whether entirely true or apocryphal, perfectly captured the public's perception of him. A man-child on a throne, obsessed with trivialities while his empire drifted towards a cliff. It was a moment of utter humiliation for the court, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of imperial dignity. But it was also a deeply human moment. It was the cry of a man who had no control over the great matters of his life, his health, his marriage, his government, and who was now being denied one of the few simple pleasures he understood and enjoyed. It was the pathetic assertion of power by a man who had none. 2 years later, in 1838, the imperial court traveled to Milan for his coronation as king of Lombardy, Venetia, where he would be crowned with the ancient iron crown of Lombardy, a sacred relic said to contain a nail from the true cross. This ceremony was even more politically charged. The Habsburgs' Italian provinces were restive, filled with secret societies dreaming of a unified, independent Italy. The coronation was intended as a massive show of force, a reminder of Austria's unshakable authority south of the Alps. For weeks, Milan was subjected to an imperial extravaganza of parades, balls, and receptions. Ferdinand played his part, smiling and waving as instructed, a passive centerpiece in Metternich's grand diplomatic spectacle. He dutifully placed the historic crown on his own head, but the gesture was hollow. Few were fooled. The Italian patriots saw not a legitimate king, but a foreign occupier, and the lavish ceremonies only deepened their resentment. Throughout all these public trials, Ferdinand had one steadfast, unwavering pillar of support: his wife, the Empress Maria Anna. Their marriage had been arranged in 1831. She was a princess of the House of Savoy, a daughter of King Victor Emmanuel I of Sardinia. She was chosen for her piety, her quiet nature, and her impeccable royal lineage. When she first arrived in Vienna and met her future husband, she was reportedly so shocked by his appearance and condition that she burst into tears. But Maria Anna was a woman of profound faith and an unshakable sense of duty. She accepted her fate, and over time, her initial shock transformed into a deep and abiding compassion. Their marriage was, by all accounts, childless. Ferdinand's epilepsy and poor health likely made a physical relationship impossible. Maria Anna embraced a different role. She became not a wife in the traditional sense, but his devoted full-time caretaker. She called him "my dear little Ferd," a term of endearment that captured the maternal nature of their bond. She was his protector, his guardian angel in the shark-infested waters of the court. When courtiers would snicker at his latest verbal fumble or his awkward shuffling walk, she would fix them with a look of such cold fury that it could silence a room. She learned to anticipate and manage his seizures, recognizing the subtle signs that a fit was imminent and steering him to a private place. She learned to calm him when he became agitated or overwhelmed by the noise and pressure of public events. She guided him through the bewildering ceremonies of state, whispering instructions in his ear, gently prompting him when he forgot his lines, and placing a steadying hand on his arm. She was his interpreter to the world, and the world's shield from his unfiltered simplicity. One courtier observed that she treated him as a mother would a beloved afflicted child. Theirs was a relationship of profound platonic affection. He, in turn, adored her. She was the one person in his life who offered him unconditional kindness, who never judged him for his disabilities, and who saw the good man beneath the broken surface. In his diary, he recorded her small acts of kindness, and fretted over her health with a touching sincerity. Their quiet domestic life in their private apartments at the Hofburg was his only true sanctuary. For 13 long years, this fragile, bizarre status quo held. The phantom reign continued. Ferdinand signed the documents the conference put before him, attended the receptions he was told to attend, and took long trips to the countryside he loved. The empire, meanwhile, was a pressure cooker with a safety valve screwed shut. In Hungary, the fiery nationalist orator Lajos Kossuth was demanding greater autonomy from Vienna. In Galicia, Polish peasants rose up against their lords in a bloody jacquerie. In the cities, a new generation of students and intellectuals, despite the censorship, were reading the forbidden works of liberal thinkers and dreaming of a constitution. The peace of the Biedermeier era was an illusion. It was the calm of stagnation, the quiet of a house slowly being eaten away by termites. In February 1848, the news arrived in Vienna like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. The people of Paris had risen up, overthrown their king, and declared a republic. The fire of revolution so long suppressed had been reignited. Its flames were spreading like wildfire across Europe, and they were heading directly for Vienna. For 13 years, the Austrian Empire had been a house of glass, beautiful in its frozen fragility, but with cracks spreading silently beneath the surface. The news from Paris in late February 1848 was the stone that shattered it all. The report that King Louis Philippe had been overthrown and a republic declared was more than just foreign news. It was a permissive signal, a spark thrown into a vast dry tinderbox. Suddenly, the impossible seemed possible. The suffocating quiet of the Biedermeier era was broken, and the air in Vienna, thick with the scent of melting snow and coal smoke, began to crackle with a dangerous new energy. The initial reaction in the Hofburg was one of practiced dismissal. Prince Metternich, now a venerable but increasingly out-of-touch 74-year-old, had seen revolutions come and go. He was the man who had defeated Napoleon through diplomacy, the man who had designed the concert of Europe. He had built this system to withstand such shocks. He assured the anxious imperial family that the Viennese spirit was loyal, that this was a French madness that would not cross the Rhine. He was catastrophically wrong. He had spent so long policing thoughts that he no longer understood what people were actually thinking. Beneath the surface of Viennese life, discontent had been simmering for years. The censorship was chafing. The secret police were loathed, and a series of poor harvests had left the city's working class hungry and desperate. In the university, students devoured forbidden liberal pamphlets, dreaming of a unified Germany and a constitutional government. Among the city's artisans and merchants, there was deep resentment over the state's inefficient bureaucracy and the stifling economic controls that hampered their prosperity. They were a people waiting for a voice, for a moment. That voice arrived in early March, not in person but in print. Lajos Kossuth, the brilliant and fiery Hungarian nationalist, had delivered a blistering speech to the Hungarian Diet in Pressburg, modern-day Bratislava, just a short journey down the Danube from Vienna. In it, he decried the Habsburg government as a charnel house, whose pestilential air was poisoning the empire. He demanded a constitution not just for Hungary, but for all the peoples of the empire. Smuggled copies of the speech were printed and circulated throughout Vienna. It was electrifying. Kossuth's words gave shape and voice to the vague, unspoken desires of the Viennese liberals. The tipping point came on March 13th. It began, as so many revolutions do, with students. They gathered in the great hall of the university, their youthful faces flushed with excitement and a sense of historic purpose. They drafted a petition, a list of demands that were, by the standards of the day, radical: freedom of the press, freedom of speech, academic freedom, and, most importantly, the immediate dismissal of Prince Metternich, the living symbol of the old repressive order. From the university, they began to march towards the Landhaus, the nearby seat of the Diet of Lower Austria. As they moved through the narrow medieval streets, their numbers began to swell. Shopkeepers, artisans, workers, and well-dressed burghers left their businesses and homes to join the procession. The initial student demonstration was transforming into a vast, popular uprising. The crowd that packed the square outside the Landhaus was no longer just a few hundred students. It was thousands strong, a sea of angry, hopeful faces. Inside the Landhaus, the members of the Diet, timid and conservative nobles, were terrified. They listened to the roar of the crowd outside and vacillated, unsure of what to do. News of the massive demonstration reached the Habsburg, sending waves of panic through the court. The secret state conference was convened in an emergency session. Archduke Louis, pale and indecisive, wrung his hands. Count Kolowrat, who saw in the crisis an opportunity to finally destroy his rival Metternich, secretly fanned the flames. Metternich himself remained stubbornly, arrogantly calm, advising a small show of force to disperse the rabble. And what of the emperor? Ferdinand was in his apartments, bewildered by the noise and the frantic energy that had suddenly gripped the palace. Aides and family members rushed in and out, their faces grim. He could hear the distant roar of the crowd, a sound he had never heard before. It was the sound of his world coming apart. Eyewitnesses described him as being like a frightened child in the middle of an earthquake, clinging to his wife, Empress Maria Anna, for comfort. He did not understand the demands. He did not understand the anger. He only understood that something terrible was happening. Archduke Albert, the military commander of Vienna, was ordered to restore order. He dispatched troops to the Landhaus. The soldiers, mostly non-German-speaking recruits from the empire's provinces, formed a line, their bayonets fixed. The crowd pressed forward, shouting, "Down with Metternich!" Someone threw a stone. A nervous officer gave an order. A volley of shots rang out. The crowd screamed. In the front ranks, 5 people fell to the cobblestones, bleeding. That was the moment the demonstration turned into a revolution. The sight of blood transformed the crowd's anger into a furious rage. Murderers! Butchers! They screamed at the soldiers. The bodies of the victims, the Marchfalleni, the March Fallen, were lifted onto shoulders and paraded through the streets, their blood a testament to the regime's tyranny. The city exploded. Barricades made from overturned carts, paving stones, and furniture sprang up in the working-class suburbs. Gunsmiths' shops were looted. 2 symbols of the old order were targeted with particular fury. The city's toll booths, representing hated taxes, were burned to the ground, and Metternich's private villa was stormed and sacked. Back in the Hofburg, the imperial family was now effectively under siege. The sound of gunfire echoed through the city. They were trapped, and their options were dwindling by the hour. A delegation of citizens managed to gain entry to the palace, demanding an audience. They were brought before the state conference. Their message was simple. The city would not be pacified until Metternich was dismissed and a constitution was granted. The pressure inside the palace became unbearable. Even the most conservative members of the imperial family, like the formidable Archduchess Sophia, realized that a sacrifice was necessary to save the dynasty. All eyes turned to Metternich. The man who had dominated Austria and Europe for nearly 4 decades was now a liability. His rivals, led by Kolowrat, urged the family to dismiss him. Archduke Louis, finally broken by the crisis, agreed. They went to Ferdinand. It is unclear how much he understood of the final fateful conversation. He was likely told in simple terms that to make the noise and the violence stop, the prince had to go. They put the words in his mouth. Metternich himself, in a final desperate appeal, came before the emperor, but the decision had been made. Ferdinand, looking not at Metternich but at the other archdukes, turned to an aide and uttered the simple, devastating words that ended an era. Ja, soll nicht mehr hier sein. Sagen Sie dem Volk, dass ich mit allem zufrieden bin. Ja, sollte nicht mehr hier sein. Tell the people that I agree to everything. Metternich, stunned into silence, bowed and left the room. His political life was over. That night, the great prince, the coachman of Europe, fled Vienna in disguise, hidden in a laundry cart, beginning a long and humiliating journey into exile. His fall was a seismic event, a symbol that the old world was truly dead. The court hoped this sacrifice would be enough. Ferdinand, seeming to believe the crisis was over, now that the source of the conflict was gone, appeared on a palace balcony. He smiled and waved weakly to the cheering crowds below. He promised them a constitution. He promised them freedom of the press. He promised them everything they wanted. For a brief, intoxicating moment, he was a hero. The Viennese, in a surge of revolutionary fervor and naive optimism, hailed him as Ferdinand the Good, their people's emperor. But the promises were hollow because the man who made them had no understanding of their meaning. He was simply doing what he had always done, agreeing with the last person he spoke to, desperate to make the conflict and the shouting go away. The imperial family, horrified by the collapse of authority and the sweeping concessions, knew they had lost control of Vienna. The city was now in the hands of a new National Guard and the radical students of the Academic Legion. The court was no longer the ruler of Vienna, it was its prisoner. Archduchess Sophia, a woman of steel will and sharp political instincts, decided they had to escape. Under the pretext of Ferdinand's delicate health requiring a change of air, a secret flight was planned. In the dead of night on May 17, 1848, the imperial family slipped out of Vienna and boarded a train. Ferdinand himself was reportedly told they were just going on a short trip. He was confused and distressed, repeatedly asking when they could return to his beloved Schönbrunn. They were heading for the safety of Innsbruck, in the heart of the loyal, conservative, and staunchly Catholic Tyrol. From this mountain fortress, the counter-revolution could begin to plot its return. While the court was in exile in Innsbruck, the fire they had fled continued to rage across the empire. The revolution in Vienna had been the signal for uprisings everywhere. In Budapest, the Hungarians, led by Kossuth, passed the April laws, which established their own responsible government, effectively making Hungary a separate state linked to Austria only by the person of the monarch. In Milan and Venice, the people rose up, drove out the Austrian garrisons, and declared independent republics. The veteran Austrian commander in Italy, the 81-year-old Field Marshal Joseph Radetzky, was forced into a humiliating retreat. In Prague, Czech nationalists organized a Pan-Slav Congress, dreaming of a federal empire where Slavic peoples would have equal rights with the Germans and Hungarians. In the space of a few short months, the mighty Habsburg Empire seemed to be disintegrating. But the court in Innsbruck was not idle, and the forces of reaction were gathering strength. The very chaos of the revolution began to create a backlash. The different nationalist movements, initially united against the central government, soon began to clash with each other. The Hungarians' assertive Magyar nationalism alienated the Croats, Serbs, and Romanians living within their kingdom. The imperial court skillfully exploited these divisions, promising the Croats and Serbs protection against the Hungarians. They found a powerful ally in the fiercely anti-Hungarian Croatian governor, Josip Jelačić. Most importantly, the army remained loyal not to the revolutionary government in Vienna, but to the dynasty. Radetzky in Italy regrouped his forces and, in a brilliant campaign, decisively defeated the Piedmontese army at the Battle of Custoza in late July, reconquering Milan and crushing the Italian Revolution. In Prague, in June, a minor street fight escalated into an uprising, giving the ruthless commander of the city's garrison, Prince Alfred zu Windisch-Grätz, the pretext he needed. He bombarded the city into submission, dissolved the Pan-Slav Congress, and imposed martial law. He had shown that revolution could be defeated with grapeshot and cannon. These victories emboldened the court camarilla surrounding Ferdinand. Led by Archduchess Sophia, they now saw a path to restoring absolute power. They had two loyal armies under two ruthless commanders, Radetzky and Windisch-Grätz, and a leader of the southern Slavs in Jelačić. The only obstacle remaining was the revolutionary capital itself, Vienna. In October, the final confrontation was triggered. The government in Vienna ordered troops to march to Hungary to help crush Kossuth's rebellion. The German nationalist radicals in the city, who saw the Hungarians as allies in the fight against the Slavic-dominated Habsburg court, rose up to stop them. In a bloody riot, they lynched the Minister of War, Theodor von Latour, hanging his mutilated body from a lamppost. This was the October Uprising. It was a fatal mistake. The horrific murder alienated the moderate middle classes and gave the court the perfect excuse to act. They declared Vienna to be an open rebellion. From his base in Bohemia, Prince Windisch-Grätz, the conqueror of Prague, began to march his army south. From the Croatian border, Jelačić marched his army north. The two forces converged on Vienna. The revolutionary city was now surrounded by a ring of iron, facing the full vengeful might of the Imperial army. The final bloody act of the Vienna Revolution was about to begin, and in the middle of it all, a pawn in the game of giants, was the gentle, confused emperor in whose name this war was being fought. The city of Vienna in late October 1848 was a place of frantic energy and creeping dread. It was a city living on borrowed time. The brief, intoxicating summer of revolution, with its passionate debates in the coffee houses, its newly free press churning out pamphlets, and its citizens proudly bearing arms in the National Guard, was over. Now the city was an isolated island of rebellion in a sea of counter-revolution. A ring of iron, 70,000 strong, was closing around it. From the north and west came the army of Prince Alfred zu Windisch-Grätz, the conqueror of Prague. He was the very embodiment of the old aristocratic order, imperious, cold, and utterly contemptuous of the revolutionary rabble. For him, this was not a political negotiation, it was a pest control operation. He had come to cleanse Vienna of its democratic fever with fire and steel. From the south came the Croatian army of Ben Josip Jelačić, a man who saw the radicals in Vienna as allies of his mortal enemies, the Hungarian nationalists. His troops, known for their ferocity, were eager for the plunder of a great imperial city. Inside Vienna, the mood was a volatile mix of defiance and terror. The defense was in the hands of a curious and ultimately doomed alliance. There was Wenzel Messenhauser, a former army officer, and a thoughtful, respected commander of the National Guard. There were the students of the Academic Legion, filled with romantic zeal, but with little military experience. There were the armed workers from the suburbs who had the most to lose from a restoration of the old order. And there was the charismatic and highly experienced Polish general, Józef Bem, a veteran of past uprisings, who had rushed to Vienna to offer his expertise. He was a brilliant artilleryman and a born leader, but he was a commander with a phantom army, trying to impose order on a chaotic and poorly equipped militia. For several days, a tense standoff ensued. Windisch-Grätz issued an ultimatum, unconditional surrender. The city refused. The Viennese radicals clung to one desperate hope: the new revolutionary government of Hungary. An army had been dispatched by Kossuth to relieve the city. The fate of Vienna, and perhaps of the entire German Revolution, now depended on whether this Hungarian force could break through the imperial lines. From the high tower of St. Stephen's Cathedral, lookouts scanned the eastern horizon, praying for the sight of their Hungarian allies. On October 28th, the bombardment began. The thunder of Windisch-Grätz's cannon was a terrifying, unfamiliar sound for the city of waltzes and pastries. Shells rained down on the outer suburbs, smashing through rooftops, setting buildings ablaze, and sending terrified civilians scurrying into cellars. The sound was a physical manifestation of the dynasty's vengeance, a brutal reply to the city's brief dream of freedom. The fighting was savage, a desperate struggle of street-to-street combat. The students and workers fought with incredible bravery, erecting barricades and defending them with old hunting rifles, pikes, and anything that could be used as a weapon. General Bem, a whirlwind of energy, raced from one hot spot to another, directing cannon fire and trying to shore up the crumbling defenses. But courage alone was no match for professional discipline and overwhelming firepower. The Imperial troops, methodical and ruthless, advanced block by block, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. On October 30th, the city's last hope was extinguished. On the plains of Schwechat, just outside the city and in full view of the watchers in St. Stephen's Tower, the Hungarian relief army clashed with Jelachich's forces. The Hungarians were poorly led and hesitant. After a brief, sharp battle, they were routed. The distant puffs of smoke and the sight of the Hungarian army in full retreat was a death sentence for Vienna. The cheers of defiance in the city died in people's throats, replaced by the silence of despair. The following day, October 31st, the Imperial army launched its final assault. They stormed the city center. The last pockets of resistance were overwhelmed. The Habsburg, which had been in the hands of the revolutionaries, was recaptured. The battle for Vienna was over. A funereal quiet fell over the battered, smoking city, broken only by the tramp of soldiers' boots on the cobblestones and the occasional summary crack of a firing squad. The retribution was swift and brutal. Windisch-Grätz, now the military dictator of the capital, was determined to make an example of Vienna. Martial law was declared. The National Guard and the Academic Legion were dissolved, and citizens were ordered to surrender their weapons on pain of death. House-to-house searches were conducted, thousands were arrested, special military tribunals were set up bypassing the regular justice system, and they began handing out death sentences with chilling efficiency. The leaders of the defense who were captured met their fate quickly. Wenzel Messenhauser was court-martialed and shot. Others were hanged. The most symbolic execution, however, was that of Robert Blum. Blum was not Viennese. He was a prominent left-wing delegate from the Frankfurt Parliament, the all-German assembly that was attempting to write a liberal constitution for a unified Germany. He had traveled to Vienna as an observer to show solidarity with the uprising. Despite his parliamentary immunity, Windisch-Grätz had him arrested, tried by a military court, and executed by firing squad in the Brigittenau Meadows on November 9th. His last words were reportedly, "I die for German freedom, for which I have fought. May the fatherland remember me." His execution was a calculated act of political terror. It was a message sent in blood from the Habsburgs to the liberals in Frankfurt and across Germany. Your dreams of a unified constitutional Germany are a fantasy. We, the old dynasties, have the armies, and we will not hesitate to use them. The execution of Blum marked the moment the tide turned decisively against the revolutions of 1848 across the German-speaking world. Into this conquered, terrified city, the imperial court returned, but they did not return to the Hofburg in the city center. Instead, they took up residence in the Schönbrunn Palace on the outskirts, still surrounded by the comforting presence of loyal troops. Ferdinand, who had spent the duration of the crisis in the Moravian city of Olmütz, but for the man she cared for so deeply, seeing his suffering end was probably her primary motivation. Her gentle but persistent persuasion would have been the final decisive factor in convincing Ferdinand to accept his fate. He did not fight them. For a man who had never wanted the throne and who had found its burdens to be a source of daily torment, the proposal of abdication was not a threat, but a release. Here was a way out, a chance to escape the noise, the arguments, the terrifying decisions, and the endless, incomprehensible ceremonies. Here was the promise of a quiet life, the life he had always craved, surrounded by his books, his music, and his beloved botanical specimens. The court coup succeeded so smoothly precisely because its victim was a willing, even eager one. The decision was finalized. The court moved from the still unsettled capital of Vienna to the quiet, provincial security of Olmütz in Moravia. The city was under the firm control of the army. It was a controlled environment, far from any prying eyes or potential dissent. It was the perfect stage for the final, carefully choreographed scene of Ferdinand's reign. The date was set for December 2nd, the anniversary of the great Napoleonic victory at Austerlitz, a day of past Habsburg humiliation that would now be repurposed as a day of dynastic renewal. The invitations were sent to the archdukes, the ministers, and the highest military commanders. The stage was being set for the final act of the Phantom Reign. The 2nd of December, 1848, dawned cold and gray over the provincial Moravian city of Olmütz. The air was heavy with the coming of a hard winter. But inside the grand Baroque Archbishop's palace, where the imperial court had taken refuge, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of chill, the cold, momentous weight of history being made. In a large, ornate reception room, the highest figures of the Austrian Empire were assembling. They were the archdukes of the House of Habsburg in their immaculate white and gold dress uniforms, the ministers of the new government in sober black, and the top military commanders, men like Windisch, Gratz, and Jelačić, their chests glittering with medals won in the recent brutal suppression of the revolution. They spoke in hushed, nervous tones, their breath misting in the unheated air. They were the audience and the witnesses for the final, carefully choreographed scene of Ferdinand's reign. Shortly after dawn, the doors opened. The imperial family entered. At the center was Emperor Ferdinand, now 55 years old. He looked frail and diminished, his familiar lurching gait made more uncertain by the gravity of the occasion. He was dressed in the simple uniform of an Austrian field marshal. His face, as always, was a mask of placid confusion, but his eyes darted around the room, as if searching for a familiar landmark in a strange and terrifying landscape. By his side, a pillar of serene composure, was his wife, the Empress Maria Anna. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of sorrow, duty, and perhaps a profound relief. Behind them came the formidable Archduchess Sophia, her back ramrod straight, her face set like stone. Her ambition was the engine driving this entire event, and next to her, pale but composed, was her son, the 18-year-old Archduke Franz Joseph. He looked impossibly young to be shouldering the destiny of a vast empire, yet there was a seriousness about him, a premature gravity that bespoke the rigorous, relentless training he had endured his entire life for this very moment. They took their places. There was no throne, only a simple table. The ceremony was designed to be swift, businesslike, and devoid of the grand mystical pomp of a coronation. This was an unmaking, not a making, of a monarch. The new prime minister, Prince Schwarzenberg, stepped forward. In a clear, emotionless voice, he read a formal proclamation. He spoke of the grave challenges facing the empire, of the need for a strong hand to guide the state, and of the emperor's noble, patriotic decision to lay down his heavy burden for the good of his people. It was a masterpiece of political spin, transforming a palace coup into an act of selfless sacrifice. Then it was Ferdinand's turn. An aide handed him a piece of paper. In his halting, slurred voice, a voice that had caused him a lifetime of humiliation, he began to read his abdication statement. The words had been written for him by Schwarzenberg. They were formal, legalistic, and empty of any personal sentiment. He declared that grave reasons had led him to the irrevocable decision to renounce the imperial crown. He stumbled over the long official phrases, but he dutifully read to the end. He had performed his last official act, signing his own political death warrant. The official part was over. What happened next was personal and far more poignant. Ferdinand turned to face his nephew, Franz Joseph, who was standing before him, his head bowed. The old emperor looked at the young man who was about to take his place. In that moment, the years of courtly artifice seemed to fall away, and all that was left was the simple, good-hearted man that Ferdinand had always been. He reached out and placed his hands on his nephew's shoulders. With a simple paternal affection that touched even the cynical hearts in that room, he said, "May God bless you. Be good. God will protect you." Then he added in a voice filled with a weary, almost joyful relief, "It was gladly done." He embraced his successor. The young Franz Joseph, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment, by the weight of the crown descending upon him, and perhaps by a genuine affection for his gentle uncle, fell to his knees before Ferdinand and kissed his hand. Some witnesses reported that the new 18-year-old emperor was weeping. Ferdinand, his final duty performed, seemed to relax completely. As he and Maria Anna turned to leave the room, he reportedly turned to her with a smile of pure, childlike liberation and said, "Komm jetzt, packen wir unsere Koffer." Come now, let's go pack our bags. And just like that, it was over. The phantom reign had ended. Ferdinand I was no longer emperor. He was simply Ferdinand Habsburg, a private citizen. The assembled dignitaries immediately swarmed around the new emperor, Franz Joseph I, pledging their allegiance, their faces a mixture of relief and renewed ambition. The unmaking of the old emperor was complete, and the making of the new one had begun. On the surface, the abdication of Ferdinand I was a model of dignified, orderly transition in a time of extreme crisis. It was presented to the world and recorded in the official histories as a noble sacrifice, the final patriotic act of Ferdinand the Benign. It was the story of a good, if simple, man who recognized his own limitations and stepped aside for a younger, stronger leader to save the empire. But history is rarely so simple. For over a century and a half, historians have peeled back the layers of this carefully constructed narrative, debating the true nature of this transfer of power. Was it a voluntary abdication born of a rare moment of personal clarity, or was it a cold, calculated palace coup, a deposition in all but name? The official narrative, the one carefully crafted by Schwarzenberg and the victorious counter-revolutionaries, is one of selfless duty. In this interpretation, Ferdinand, a man who had always abhorred violence and conflict, was genuinely horrified by the bloodshed of 1848. He saw the empire tearing itself apart and understood, with a simple wisdom that transcended political cunning, that he was not the man to heal it. His promises to the revolutionaries in March had compromised him, making it impossible for him to act as the unifying figure the dynasty now needed. His abdication was therefore a moment of supreme patriotism, a conscious decision to subordinate his own personal position to the survival of the empire. Proponents of this view point to his known character, his kindness, his aversion to conflict, and his lack of personal ambition are all well documented. The act of stepping aside, they argue, was perfectly consistent with the personality of a man who had never craved power and found its burdens to be a source of immense personal suffering. His parting words to Franz Joseph, "Be good, it was gladly done," are presented as prima facie evidence of his willing consent. He was, in this telling, the emperor who truly did give up the throne to save the crown. This interpretation is further bolstered by his subsequent life. In the 27 years that followed his abdication, he never once expressed bitterness or regret. He never intrigued or attempted to interfere in politics. He lived a life of quiet contentment in Prague, seemingly overjoyed to be free of his former responsibilities. This perspective paints Ferdinand not as a fool, but as a man who possessed a unique kind of wisdom, the profound and often rare wisdom to know his own limitations. His final act as emperor, therefore, was his most successful and effective one, clearing the way for a new reign that would, for better or worse, define the final chapter of the Habsburg Empire. However, a darker, more cynical, and perhaps more realistic interpretation has long shadowed this official story. This counter-argument posits that Ferdinand was not the author of his abdication, but its primary victim. He was pushed from the throne by a ruthless court faction, a camarilla of iron-willed individuals who saw him as an intolerable obstacle to their plans. The leaders of this coup were his ambitious sister-in-law, Sophia, who had been grooming her son for power since his birth, the new prime minister, Schwarzenberg, who needed a new monarch unbound by past promises, and the military commanders like Windisch Gretz, who believed that only an authoritarian restoration could save the state. In their eyes, Ferdinand was a walking disaster. His concessions to the revolutionaries in March, promising a constitution firing Metternich, had shown him to be dangerously weak and impressionable. He had, in their view, legitimized the revolution. As long as he remained on the throne, his promises could be seen as legally binding, hindering the new government's plan to sweep away the revolutionary gains, dissolve the newly elected Reichstag, and restore absolutism. Schwarzenberg needed a monarch who could rule without being haunted by the ghosts of March. According to this view, the abdication was a meticulously staged piece of political theater. Ferdinand, isolated from any independent advisors, was psychologically manipulated by his own family and ministers. They worked on his fears, played on his sense of duty, and leveraged his confusion. The entire process was carefully managed to ensure his compliance. The ceremony in Olmütz was not a transfer of power. It was the public ratification of a decision that had already been made for him in secret. This argument is strongly supported by the questionable legality of the act itself. In the Kingdom of Hungary, the abdication was never accepted as legitimate. The Hungarian Diet argued with considerable legal justification that their king could not abdicate without the consent of the Diet, nor could the line of succession be altered unilaterally. According to Hungarian law, if Ferdinand abdicated, the crown should pass to his next brother, Franz Karl, the father of Franz Joseph, not directly to his nephew. Franz Karl was also pressured to renounce his rights, a move of dubious legality. For the Hungarian patriots, Ferdinand remained their rightful king, until his death. Franz Joseph was, in their eyes, a usurper, a foreign emperor imposed on them by military force. This legal challenge became one of the central justifications for Hungary's continued, heroic, and ultimately doomed war for independence in 1849. It suggests that the transfer of power was, at the very least, a constitutional coup d'etat, pushed through by the force of the victorious imperial army. Finally, there is the inescapable question of Ferdinand's mental state. While proponents of the voluntary abdication theory argue he was lucid enough to make the decision, critics contend that his well-documented cognitive and psychological disabilities made him incapable of giving true, informed consent. Was he fully aware of the profound political and constitutional implications of his actions? Or was he simply following a script prepared for him by his caretakers, just as he had been coached through countless ceremonies for the past 13 years? His childlike relief at being able to go pack our bags can be read in two ways: as the joy of a man freely laying down a heavy burden, or as the profound incomprehension of a man who never truly grasped the weight of that burden in the first place. The truth, as is so often the case in history, likely lies somewhere in the murky, tragic space between these two extremes. Ferdinand was almost certainly pressured, managed, and manipulated by the formidable, determined figures around him. It is difficult to imagine him conceiving of and executing such a momentous political act entirely on his own initiative. Yet, it is equally plausible that the pressure found a uniquely willing recipient. The proposal to abdicate, when it was presented to him, likely aligned perfectly with his own deepest, most cherished desires: to escape the turmoil, to end the violence, and to retreat into the quiet, peaceful, and predictable life he had always craved. The palace coup succeeded so smoothly, not just because its perpetrators were ruthless, but because its victim was relieved. Ultimately, the controversy over Ferdinand's abdication reveals the central, unresolved tragedy of his life. Even in this, his most significant and consequential historical act, his own agency remains a mystery. Was he a wise, self-sacrificing patriot who made a difficult choice for the good of all? Or was he a helpless puppet, his strings pulled by the ambitions of others, a sage or a simpleton? History, like his own court, has never been able to quite decide. He remains a ghost at the feast of his own reign, his true intentions and his final level of understanding forever obscured by the shadows of his illness and the towering, ruthless ambitions of those who claim to serve him. With the stroke of a pen and a few mumbled words, in a cold Moravian palace, Ferdinand Habsburg went from being the absolute, divinely ordained emperor of a vast multinational empire to a private citizen with an immense personal fortune. His abdication was not just a personal event. It was the closing of a door on one era and the violent throwing open of another. His 18-year-old nephew, now Emperor Franz Joseph I, ascended the throne, and under the steely guidance of the arch-conservative Prime Minister Schwarzenberg, he swiftly and brutally moved to erase the gains of the revolution. The new reign, which would last for an astonishing 68 years, began with a wave of repression. The Austrian Reichstag, the empire's first and only popularly elected parliament, was dissolved by military force in March 1849. The liberal constitution it had drafted was thrown onto the scrap heap of history. Absolutist rule, more centralized and more efficient than ever before, was reimposed. In Hungary, the war for independence was crushed with the help of a massive Russian army, followed by a period of brutal military rule known as the Bach era. The reign that began in the turmoil of 1848 would guide the empire through industrialization, the humiliating military defeats that led to the creation of the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary in 1867, and ultimately into the catastrophic inferno of the First World War, a conflict that would finally shatter the ancient Habsburg dominion forever. Ferdinand's final act did not just change the ruler, it set the course for the empire's final long and dramatic chapter. But what of the man who set all this in motion? What becomes of an emperor after he gives away his empire? For Ferdinand, it was the beginning of the happiest, most peaceful, and most productive period of his life. He and the ever-loyal Empress Maria Anna chose to retire to Prague, the city where he had been crowned King of Bohemia years before. They took up residence in the magnificent Prague Castle, the ancient seat of Bohemian kings that sprawls across a hilltop overlooking the Vltava River. Here, far from the poisonous intrigues, the suffocating protocol, and the unbearable pressures of the Viennese court, Ferdinand was finally free. And in this freedom, a remarkable thing happened. The man who was universally deemed too incompetent to run an empire proved to be an exceptionally shrewd, forward-thinking, and successful man of business. As a private individual, Ferdinand was the lord of vast estates in Bohemia, including the sprawling domains of Ploskowicz and Reichstadt. He now dedicated himself to managing these properties with the same meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail he had once reserved for his botanical collections. He threw himself into the study of modern agricultural science and technology, subjects that had always fascinated him. He read technical journals, corresponded with agronomists, and invested heavily in modernizing his lands. He built sugar beet factories, introduced steam-powered plows, modernized his breweries, and experimented with new crop rotation systems. He meticulously reviewed account books, tracked profits and losses, and proved to have a keen eye for sound investments. His estates became models of efficiency and profitability. The simpleton of Vienna, the butt of 1,000 court jokes, had transformed into the sage of Prague, a respected and highly effective agricultural entrepreneur. This astonishingly successful second act raises profound and uncomfortable questions about his disastrous reign. It strongly suggests that Ferdinand's problem was never a fundamental lack of intelligence, but rather a catastrophic mismatch between his temperament, his skills, and the role he was forced by accident of birth to play. His mind was practical, scientific, methodical, and concrete. He thrived when dealing with tangible things, plants, finances, machinery, crop yields. He was utterly, hopelessly lost in the abstract, high-stakes, and deeply cynical world of diplomacy, political maneuvering, and statecraft. He was not a fool. He was a man forced into the wrong job on the grandest and most unforgiving scale imaginable. It is likely that the immense pressures of the throne, the constant sensory overload of court life, the endless conflict, and the rigid, meaningless protocol actively exacerbated his neurological conditions. The stress probably triggered more frequent seizures and worsened his speech impediment, making him appear far less capable than he actually was. Freed from that immense psychological burden in the calm and predictable routines of his Prague retirement, his true practical abilities were finally allowed to blossom. He became, over the years, a beloved figure in his adopted city. He and Maria Anna were known for their extensive philanthropy. They donated vast sums to support charities for the poor, fund the construction of schools and orphanages, and act as patrons for cultural institutions. They took daily walks or carriage rides through the city, and Ferdinand, with his familiar awkward gait and simple friendly smile, became a cherished local character. The people of Prague treated him with a mixture of reverence and affection. He was their former king, the kindly old emperor who had stepped aside for the good of his people, a living link to a bygone era. He lived a life of quiet, comfortable routine. His days were filled with the simple pleasures he had always craved. He would spend his mornings reviewing estate accounts, his afternoons in his greenhouses, tending to his collection of rare plants, and his evenings listening to music or playing cards with his wife. He outlived almost all of the powerful figures who had dominated and ultimately ended his reign. He outlived the ruthless Prince Schwarzenberg, who died suddenly in 1852. He outlived the conqueror of Vienna, Prince Windisch Gratz. He even outlived his own formidable sister-in-law, the empress maker, Archduchess Sophia. He saw them all pass away one by one while he lived on, peacefully tending his gardens and balancing his books. His long and peaceful retirement casts his abdication in a new light. It was not just an escape, it was a homecoming to his true self. His story carries a lasting significance for our understanding of power and leadership. He was one of the last European monarchs who could be so obviously, painfully unfit for rule, yet still hold the throne simply by right of blood. His reign was a stark demonstration of the fatal flaw at the heart of any purely hereditary system. His removal and the accession of the disciplined, duty-obsessed Franz Joseph signaled a fundamental shift. In the new turbulent age of nationalism and industrialization, a monarch could no longer simply be. A monarch had to do. They needed to be a chief executive, a master bureaucrat, a tireless public symbol. Ferdinand was the end of the old line, a tragic relic of a time when bloodline was the only qualification that mattered. Ferdinand died peacefully in his Prague residence on June 29, 1875, at the age of 82. He had lived in quiet retirement for 27 years, nearly twice as long as he had reigned as emperor. His beloved Maria Anna, his constant guardian and companion, had passed away 9 years earlier. He was laid to rest in the Imperial crypt in Vienna, back among the long line of Habsburg emperors, from which he had always been an anomaly. His legacy is a quiet, gentle, and deeply ambiguous one. He was not a great ruler. By any conventional measure, his reign was a period of stagnation that culminated in a disastrous revolutionary crisis. Yet he is remembered by many historians and was remembered by his subjects with a strange and persistent fondness. In an age of cynical, power-hungry, and often brutal leaders, his simple decency, his profound kindness, and his complete lack of malice stand out in stark relief. Perhaps the historian who called him the last good king was not referring to his political skill, but to the uncorrupted state of his soul. In the grand, often brutal, and blood-soaked tapestry of European history, the thread of Ferdinand I's life is a pale and gentle one. He is often a mere footnote in the story of his much longer reigning and more consequential successor, a historical curiosity, the simple emperor famous for wanting his apricot dumplings. It is easy and perhaps even logical to dismiss him as a failure, a weak link in the long formidable chain of the mighty Habsburgs. But to do so is to miss the profound, unsettling, and deeply human lesson of his life. Ferdinand was never meant to be a king. He was a man born into a role that his mind, his body, and his very soul were not built to sustain. He was a botanist forced to be a strategist, a gentle musician compelled to preside over an empire held together by bayonets. His reign was never his own. It belonged to the ministers who ruled in his name, the courtiers who plotted in the palace shadows, and the wife who guided his every step. For 13 long years he was a prisoner of his own crown, a living symbol whose personal desires, fears, and discomforts were utterly irrelevant to the vast, impersonal machinery of the state. Yet, in the final, chaotic days of his reign, when the empire was burning and the world as he knew it was collapsing, he found a moment of perfect, unassailable clarity. Pressured, manipulated, frightened, and exhausted, he was offered a choice: to cling to the title that had brought him nothing but misery, or to lay it down and restore the peace he so desperately craved. He chose peace. He chose to give up the throne, not for personal gain or ambition, two concepts he barely understood, but for the good of the dynasty and the people he was supposed to lead. Was it an act of weakness or an act of wisdom? Perhaps it was something far more profound. Perhaps in that singular moment, his profound weakness, his inability to rule, his hatred of conflict, his crippling passivity, became the source of his greatest and only strength. A stronger, more prideful man might have fought to keep the crown, plunging the empire deeper into civil war. A more cunning man might have tried to outmaneuver his rivals, perpetuating the cycle of intrigue and bloodshed. Ferdinand, in his simplicity, did the one thing they could neither fight nor outmaneuver. He simply, and with great relief, let go. His story is a quiet rebellion against the very idea that greatness is defined by power, ambition, and the ruthless exercise of dominance. He found his purpose not in the wearing of the crown, but in the taking of it off. In the 27 years he lived as a private citizen in Prague, he was more successful, more respected, and by all accounts, infinitely happier than he ever was as Emperor of Austria. He reminds us that a life's worth is not measured by the height of the throne one occupies, but by the peace one is able to find in one's own heart. He was Ferdinand the Benign, the emperor who was too kind for his crown, and whose most enduring legacy was the quiet, unassuming grace with which he finally and gladly laid it down.